Let's see, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I hope you're seeing that.
Looks good on my end.
You are seeing it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. What time are we getting to be? A little after. Yeah, so we've got till about 10 o'clock or so?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Ashley, for the invitation to come and talk to you all today. A little bit about growing under plastic. My name is Chris Mullins. I work at Virginia State University, and I primarily deal with things like greenhouses and high tunnels and growing vegetables in those. And so today I just want to take a few minutes or a little while this morning and go over some of the options and talk a little bit about some issues you might have and just try to give some highlights of growing under plastic in different ways. I've got a couple, I think I've got about 3 videos I might try to share today if we have time during the presentation. But if anybody has questions, it looks like we're a fairly small group. So if anybody's got questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat, or I guess you can. They've got the ability to unmute themselves, don't they, Ashley? Everybody does.
Yeah, they should. So.
Okay, so go ahead and we can stop and do that. And like I said, it's not a huge group, so let's plan on doing that. So growing under plastic. What we're talking about is mostly high tunnels, or you might call them hoop houses. And there's different types there. We'll go over those in a little bit, but it also might be greenhouses. And a traditional greenhouse is going to have an active heating and cooling system. It's going to have some type of maybe unit heater or boiler, and it also might have exhaust fans. Whereas it's generally a little more expensive to construct. And we think of a high tunnel or a hoop house more or less as an unheated greenhouse. So it's a little different. And I'll show you some pictures in a little bit, but a lot less expensive to build. And there probably are some opportunities. And one of the reasons that you're probably here at this meeting or this series of meetings in the last little bit has been probably you see the opportunity in vegetable production or growing horticulture crops, and with growing under plastic or growing in some type of like a high tunnel or a greenhouse gives you the ability to extend the growing season, or to grow out of the normal growing conditions that are optimal for the plants. And so this allows you to tap into different markets that you wouldn't normally be able to, whether it's earlier in the season, maybe later in the season, or throughout the whole year. Sometimes we see higher yields and quality in greenhouses and high tunnels. So that might be an opportunity for you. This might be a way to kind of get into organic production, and certainly locally grown, as people are very interested in growing, or consumers are very interested in buying things local. The ability to kind of trick the growing season or trick the plants and have them produce gives you that ability to be locally grown. So again, a high tunnel, a lot like the pictures that you're seeing here. Many of them have ventilation is accomplished through drop-down curtains or roll-up curtains to have air movement through there. Generally, we're thinking about crops that are grown in the soil and not necessarily in containers or media, like we'll talk about at the end when we think about hydroponics and aquaponics. So what we're thinking about with a high tunnel is mostly season extension, trying to get some earliness in the springtime with your crops, or extending that season into the fall. But it also might be important in the wintertime if you're thinking about some cool season crops. It could definitely help you there. Keeps rain and hail off the crops. Less free water on the leaves might mean less disease. And also, because you can somewhat exclude insects in here. So high tunnels aren't perfect, but they're a good tool in your farming operation or enterprise. Some of you might have heard of this NRCS program, the USDA NRCS program. It's a cost share, the EQIP program for building and purchasing a high tunnel. If you haven't already, look into that. Ashley could point you in the right direction to where the USDA service center is in y'all's area, and how to talk to the NRCS people and what you might have to do. Really good program, and when you can get cost share of, I don't know, 60 or 70%, that's pretty good to put a structure up. So this could work for some of you, and it might have already. Some of you might be on here because you've already taken advantage of this program. So here's some pictures. We think about these single bay high tunnels, and that's mostly what everybody's thinking about in Virginia, are going to be these single Quonset hut type structures that might have a peaked roof, like you see the top right and left pictures are more of a peak to the roof instead of a round roof, like the little PVC structure on the bottom pictures. Those are more rounded. So this is kind of what we're thinking about. A lot of the world is growing though in these kind of high tunnels. The one on the top left are these multi-bay or field scale structures. And they're a little different. They're mostly for keeping rain events, hail events, and off of the crop, and are really almost like main season structures, and not really for season extension, but they're certainly out there, and they can be a little bit for season extension. They can help you that way. Let's see here. I think one of the things we need to think about is if you're considering putting one of these up, or have already, you kind of know about this, but what we're thinking about when we locate the structure, we want to orient it mostly because of those drop down curtains or those roll up curtains where the air moves in a perpendicular manner through the house to cool it. You want it kind of wherever the prevailing winds are, you want it to be in that perpendicular arrangement, so that as the curtains are dropped, generally the air is going to be passing through the structure and out the other side. That's going to be probably the main thing you'll think about in terms of the direction of the ridge of the structure, or how it's located, how it's oriented. Not so much for light for these, but really for ventilation. You want to consider shade. You don't want to build a structure like this very close to trees that are going to shade it, especially on the north side of structures or trees or anything like that. It's very important to think about drainage wherever you site this, to try to make sure that it's going to be a fairly well drained location, or at the very least, build it up, and so there might be swells or even a drain tile or drain pipe around the perimeter of the structure, so that water is moved away from the structure. And I mentioned shading from trees, but also it's important to think about if you have the ability to have windbreaks, that's good too. The main enemies of these types of structures are certainly going to be wind and snow, but wind is a one that can really damage structures. There was not too far from you all over near Meadows of Dan, there was a family that had a high tunnel, kind of a little high on a ridge, and the wind just kind of flipped it over. It picked it up and flipped it over. So that's kind of close to you all as we're thinking about high winds, and especially if it's in a sandy location. I've also known sandy locations in eastern Virginia where the ground stakes have been pulled out of the ground by wind, and the whole structure was kind of flipped over. It doesn't happen too often. I put this down here at the bottom of the slide. It says Google search. So if you go to Google and you type in high tunnel heating alternatives Missouri, I thought that was easier to tell you than trying to put out the whole long web address that they give you. You'll find a presentation that's pretty interesting on some of the things we've talked about here, siding and windbreaks and things, but also mentioned some alternative heating, potential alternative heating or passive heating type heating in these types of structures. I think it's worth checking out. It's a good resource. And if you're further considering putting one of these up, you have to think about construction. You've thought about the site, like we talked about, but the construction part, it's just various parts and pieces. You can see the lists over there: bows and purlins and ground stakes and things. And there's it involves pounding those ground stakes in the ground, putting the bows together, putting them on top of it. It's really not too difficult to put one of these structures up especially when you compare it relative to building a house or a metal building or something else. These are relatively easy to go up. So you can build them yourself with a little bit of construction knowledge and some help. There's some ladder work involved, so you have to kind of be up on a ladder doing a few things. But there's also a few companies out there that will build structures like this for you at a cost. So you have to kind of think about how it works for your situation, whether you want to try to build it or whether you're going to pay somebody to build it. And usually also there's usually somebody in every locality that kind of knows a little bit about greenhouse construction. Maybe the farmer that already has a greenhouse, the tobacco farmer, or the nursery grower. And if you talk to somebody like that, they might even give you a hand building it. So it's always a good idea to talk to your neighbors that might have had some experience in doing something like this. Okay, I put this slide in here. What made me think about it when we were talking about construction, just there's little things that you kind of have to think about. I was this guy right here is there's a section that you see in the center there that has got some sharp edges on it, and the plastic would go right over top of that. So he's using just duct tape and taping those sharp areas up, because over the next several years, while he's got that plastic over top of that bow, it can rub and tear away. And what made me start thinking about this, and I ran across this picture, is I was in our greenhouse at a research farm here last week. I was up in the ridge. We were putting some air pipes in for the fish that we were growing. And I noticed somebody, the last guys that hung a heater in there, they used some threaded rod and ran it right up through past the bow, and sticking up 2 inches into the plastic was just this piece of threaded rod. And they didn't think about it, because they just were thinking about installing what they had to install. But it's important just to think about, while I said it was a little bit easy to build these, there are some little minor details, because you're dealing with plastic and metal. And that kind of segues into the plastic part. We are covering these structures in a polyethylene type cover, or polyethylene cover. It's usually a 6 mil, what they call it, greenhouse grade plastic. That's going to be either going to have 1 or 2 layers. You can see that picture on the top right is an inflation blower. So if you've got electricity to these structures, you can put 2 layers of plastic, and you blow air in between the 2 layers. It kind of puffs up like a balloon. It inflates, and that will help you with, 1, it'll give you some insulating value on the roof of the structure, and 2, it will help maybe against winds. It'll buffer against winds moving the plastic and whipping it around and potentially tearing it. So, but if you don't, 1 layer of plastic will be fine, and it'll actually give you a little bit better light transmission, a single layer of plastic versus 2. Everything you put on top of a structure gives, shades, and most of the plants we're talking about growing, need as much light as we can get them. I would think about using that greenhouse grade and not construction grade plastic. Most of these layers of poly will be 4 to 5 year rated plastics, and that basically means they're UV protected for about 4 or 5 years. 48 months is what they say. And then they will kind of tend to degrade, and over that time also you will get the plastic will get dirty, and so you'll have less light getting through there. It also will potentially get tears over that time period. So I would recommend that you do try to replace your poly every 4 to 5 years. I have been on greenhouses that it's kind of old plastic, 7 years or more, and it does start to crack. And I was on top of a gutter connected structure walking in the gutter one day and just pushed my hand against the plastic, and it was old plastic, and it just kind of cracked. And so think about replacing that plastic at the right time intervals. There are some different types of polyethylene. As you know, in the middle part of the last century, wooden structures were, with the advent of plastics, were covered with plastic, and we've come a long way. There's lots of different additives that can be put onto some of these plastics that will help reduce the amount of radiation that's lost to the environment, a lot of the heat and also sometimes can keep radiant heat from coming in. So IR type plastics, anti-condensate type plastics, which would be on an internal layer of plastic that would keep condensation from dropping down, occurring on the plastic and dropping. And that can be good if you're growing leafy greens and you don't want a lot of water on the leaves. One of the newer things is the diffused plastics. So it kind of scatters light around. So light comes in at a direct angle and then kind of gets scattered by the plastic. Brands like Luminance and also the Solar Wrap, the picture in the top with the bubble looking things, they can have a diffused type additive, and they will it's a little better when you think about taller crops like tomatoes, or even that picture of the blackberries that are there. It will you won't get kind of differential growth. You'll get a little bit more light at the bottom of the plant too. I mean, additional light at the bottom of the plant with a diffused plastic. So there's a place for some of these things. There's also wavelength selective plastics that are coming out that are pretty interesting too. I did leave this web address down here at the bottom from Massachusetts that's does a pretty good job of summarizing some of the plastics that are out there. It's a real short little kind of write-up about some plastics, but if you're interested, that's worth looking at. So we think about managing the high tunnel structure. There's lots of things we need to manage in there: the temperature, even irrigation, fertilization, light, humidity. All these things are something that the grower is going to need to think about as they're getting into this. Growing in some type of protected structure, a greenhouse or a high tunnel, or even low tunnels, requires probably a little more management intensity than just typical outdoor vegetable production. I think you're going to see things that you have to think about more often. And some of them are, one big one is temperature and how you control that temperature. When you're outside, there's not much you can do about the temperature. When you're in a greenhouse, you turn the heater on, you run your thermostat through your computer control system to turn on fans, turn on heater when needed. But in a high tunnel, everything's manual and you don't have these active systems. So it does require a little bit more of your management. And temperature is probably one of the most important, especially when we think about cold temperatures and warm temperatures, because there's some range of optimum temperatures, and you see some of them here in this chart. And all these temperatures can really affect plants in different ways, and too hot, too cold can be a detriment to the plants. So, a lot of times people think about a high tunnel or a hoop house as something we just are going to get through the cold weather, and we have to manage that. We have to, raise the curtains up and make sure that they're closed in the appropriate time in the afternoon to maximize the heat to carry over a warmer temperature in there through the night as it gets cold outside. Or maybe some type, how we put some type of passive solar heating, maybe black covered water tubes that might be in the structure that might radiate heat at night. So all that for the, trying to prevent that cold temperature. But really, as you get into, even in the mountains where you all are, as you get into the June and July, it's warming up quite a bit and it gets very hot in those structures. So having the ability to being able to ventilate and move air out of those is just about as important as the cold. So again, it's things like venting ahead of those thresholds, maybe even using shade cloth for when it gets too hot to kind of keep the heat load down on the structure. You see there can be things like that picture there of that end wall that opens up about an 8 foot by 8 foot. And you also have side curtain walls, but sometimes an end wall might be a good place to have some type of venting system. And that might be for, because even on a early spring or winter day, it can get very hot in there on a bright day. And so you might not want to drop the curtains down, but you might just want to open up your side vents, and that can work. There's also things like ridge type vents, and we're getting ready to put one in on one of our structures at Randolph Farm here in Petersburg. That basically it goes in between the bows, and it mounts. It kind of looks like a skylight in a house, but it opens up, and so it can help create a chimney effect where the hot air is in the ridge of the house, and it can be released through that vent as cooler air comes through the side curtains or the end wall openings. So different ways that you can do this, but it is somewhat management intensive and somewhat labor intensive too when you think about it. I put these couple pictures in here because this can be an issue with structures. In greenhouses, in typical heated greenhouses, if we get snow, we can crank up the heaters, whatever that is, a unit heater or a boiler, to increase the temperature in the structure, and it'll help melt the snow off of it. We don't really have that in high tunnels, right? We don't have an automated heating system. And so this can happen if you're not careful. And one of the ways to prevent this, quite honestly, is manually removing the snow from the structure, getting out there and using some type of blunt instrument like a push broom from the inside to kind of push up and push the snow off, or to rake it off from the outside with something like that. The last thing you want to lose is your structure. The money that you put into these structures are mostly in the metal frame. And so, as you can see in these pictures, that frame is all bent, but you look, the plastic's still intact. So plastic's pretty strong. And before, one of the things I have seen growers do is cut the plastic, to let the snow through the plastic so that the weight doesn't destroy the metal frame. All right, wind, snow can be your big enemies. So we are growing in a structure that is covered. So that's what we need to think about, an artificial type of providing water to the plants, and irrigation through things like the picture there, the drip irrigation system along the row is going to be one of the best ways to do that. Occasionally, overhead irrigation can be used in these structures, especially if you are if you're growing a cover crop. Maybe you're wanting to improve the soil quality, and for some reason that space you decided to put a cover crop out, and you'd want some overhead irrigation for that. People are thinking about rainwater catchments or getting the rainwater from the roof of these structures, and it basically requires some type of gutter on each side that would collect the rainwater off the roof and convey it to some type of container. We actually are building one at our research farm in Petersburg. It's built now. It's not quite operational, but it's built, where it is a single bay structure that does have gutters on each side that will collect rainwater, and it can be utilized for the irrigation. All this irrigation can be automatic or could be manual with the use of sensors and tensiometers. It can be automated. Or at least those things can give you an idea of when to water. That's an important thing. I'll mention fertilization, and many of you probably already know about vegetable fertilization, and you are using things like this Mid-Atlantic Commercial Vegetable Guide to look at different crops and see what the fertilization should be. Of course, that soil test that you do is going to help you so much and give you recommendations. They will give you recommendations, and they're very, very good at the soil lab at Virginia Tech of getting you the right information. But possibly you could also use tissue analysis to make sure that the crop, just occasionally maybe leaf sample analysis to a lab, or a few other ways that you can kind of see if you've got the proper nutrition for the crop. And this fertilization can be added through a drip system with a fertigation apparatus, like this picture in the top there has got a picture. It's it just shows a manifold type apparatus with a Mozzi injector on it. That black thing in the kind of towards the right a little bit, right center, is a injector that works on partial pressures and pulls up fertilizer into the water stream as it's being sent to the irrigation lines. And they make those in very different sizes, and there are also some fertilizer injectors that are a little different than that, but are similar in what they do. So I mean, I think in terms of fertilization, there's things you can do. Again, it adds to your management intensity. But then one of the things we don't want to do is over fertilize. A little bit of work in high tunnels is being done. I mentioned it here. They're looking at some of the best management practices in New York for things like leafy greens. And they specifically were looking at spinach last year, I believe, and looking at different fertilizer regimens for the crop in the high tunnels, and really didn't see, for that particular crop, didn't see a lot of difference whether they were at like a quadruple rate, 200 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre, versus a very probably a half rate of what the recommendations were. So it is kind of crop specific, and some crops are going to need more fertilization than others. But one of the things we don't want to do is over fertilize, because that can lead to high soluble salt levels in the soil in these structures. And sometimes it depends. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. I've known people that have grown tomatoes after tomatoes after tomatoes after tomatoes for years, and using synthetic conventional fertilization methods, and really have never run into too much of a problem. But I've also seen people that have had problems with high salt levels, very high salt levels. And so I think you have to be mindful of the amount of fertilizer that you apply, that it's not too much. This can happen with organic amendments and synthetic fertilizers. But because that we're covered, and we don't get that rainfall, we don't get that normal leaching out that you'd see in open field practice, where that the rain is just moving those salts down and out of the growing area or the root zone. Of course, some crops are going to be more sensitive to this than others, and you're going to also see, for example, like berries. If you're growing raspberries or the caneberries or blackberries, they're going to be more sensitive to salt damage, or potentially have more salt damage than maybe tomatoes. Peppers might be less or more sensitive than tomatoes. But also young plants. So seedlings, as you're putting them in there, if you see some wilting, some necrotic areas, some dying back, that potentially could be that, because they will, the young plants are going to be more sensitive to high salt levels. But it goes back to like we said before, making sure the site is well drained, that water is moved through there. There are some more, I guess, low soluble salt index is what they call it, and some things like ammonium nitrate or like calcium nitrate might be lower than ammonium nitrate in terms of that salt index, and potassium nitrate might be even lower than calcium, for example. So there's different maybe fertilizers that you can use to keep some of those salts out. Also, when you're thinking about compost, animal manures can be high in salt, so that might be something to stay away from. So there's some things you can do. You can, if you see that you've got soluble salts or high salt levels in there, you could remove the plastic for a season and let it rain through there and leach that out. Or you can apply water through a drip tape or overhead irrigation. One of the things that some research has shown that about 6 inches of water will reduce the salt levels, and the salt levels are going to be you're going to be measuring those like through a media extract or a pour through test that will kind of tell you in the electric conductivity is what they'll measure, and it'll be like, it might be 1.5 millimos or it might be 4 millimos. And those numbers can be reduced by maybe half with 6 inches of water applied. And so the tape could do that. And depending on the type of tape that you've got and the pressure that you've got, it could take 6 or 7 hours to get 1 inch. So it takes a while to do this leaching. But one other scenario, if you haven't built a structure, maybe you've seen or heard of these movable type high tunnels, and they're utilized for different reasons. But one of the reasons that they might be utilized would be to help this leaching occur. So a movable high tunnel can be moved from one location to another in a straight shot, and could help with some of that off-season leaching. So I did want to show a video. If that's all right. It's just a 4 or 5 minute video, but I think it's pretty interesting. Let's see if we can find it here. It's from Kentucky, University of Kentucky. And Ashley, give me a thumbs up if you can see that screen, a different screen now. And I'm going to show a video here. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it and see it.
Welcome to the University of Kentucky High Tunnel Research Facility. Hopefully you've seen our video tour that gives an overview of our research site. In this video, we will share more detailed information about our movable tunnel system. Before we talk about how we move our tunnels, let's talk about why we would want to move a tunnel at all. First, it allows us to incorporate cover cropping more heavily into our system without losing productivity inside the tunnel. This supports improved yields and helps maintain soil health. The buildup of salt in the soil is a known problem in high tunnels with years of successive production history. Salt-heavy amendments, combined with no rainfall to flush them out, can result in unacceptable salt levels in the soil. In our movable tunnel rotation, no plot is ever protected from rainfall and other precipitation for more than 9 months in a given year. By moving the tunnels, we help avoid the buildup of pest and disease pressures on a given piece of land. With the high moisture content in tunnels, disease can become a considerable challenge. That covers why we move. Let's talk briefly about where the tunnels go. Our structures are rotated between 3 adjacent plots. In the past, we have moved the tunnels 2 times a year, but we are currently only moving once per calendar year. By staggering the positions of the tunnels, we avoid shading problems. Each of our 3 movable tunnels is slightly different, and the ways that we move them vary as well. Generally speaking, the tunnel on the far left and in the center move by simply dragging across the ground on skids. The tunnel on the right moves on casters that sit on round galvanized pipe rails. All of these are modified versions of the same 30-foot by 72-foot tunnel. Let's take a little closer look at each model. This is our least expensive model to construct. The skids are constructed of Trex decking composite board. When moving, these boards do tend to bow and flex along their length, requiring us to monitor and adjust during the moving process. The tips of the skids are custom-made aluminum pieces with an eye bolt in place to allow hookup to a winch or tractor. The only difference between the first model and the second model is that the skids are reinforced with aluminum angle. Obviously, this increases the cost, but does add some rigidity to the skids. We still have to adjust the alignment periodically during and immediately after the move.
Have a little continental drift over here.
But the stress on the skid itself appears far less. Our final tunnel is different in the way it moves. Let's take a look inside and see how. This tunnel moves on casters that roll along the galvanized round pipe you see below them. As a result of being set on a track, this tunnel moves considerably easier than the other two, and it follows the lines and stays on track with the rails.
Keep going! Keep going! All right! Stop!
It requires only minimal adjustment during movement. Several steps are necessary before any of the tunnels change places. We loosen all the anchoring cables and remove the anchors from the ground. These anchors move with the tunnel each time it changes locations. We then disconnect irrigation lines and unplug inflation fans, clearing all these things out of harm's way. Next, we flip up our end walls along a hinge and secure them in that up position with a few screws. This graphic helps to show the design of our movable tunnel end walls. At this point, we are ready to move the tunnels. The setup we use includes two 9,000-pound winches hooked up to tractors or trucks. We do our best to align the winch with the path we want the tunnel to take. 4 or more people is an ideal number to have to execute this safely. 2 spotters monitor the progress of each sidewall's movement and give signals to the winch operators to keep the movement as even as possible. As you can see, there can be considerable splay and warping that happens as we move the tunnels. Ratchet straps running across the width of the tunnel can help to reduce this splay, but we have to take care not to injure the crops we are moving onto or off of. Using a pry bar, we can manually adjust the alignment. This is actually easier than it sounds. Tunnel 2 moves in much the same way as Tunnel 1. While you could use a tractor and truck to move our third tunnel, we wanted to demonstrate how much easier this system is to move than the first 2. With 6 strong people, we were able to move this unit the full 80 feet it needed to travel. With all of the tunnels moved to their final position, we will adjust alignment with the pry bar, reinstall anchors and cables, flip down and secure the end walls, and get all irrigation and electricity plugged back in. And since this is the final position before winter, we will ensure good sealing around the skids and on the end walls after the tunnel is secured. This was just an overview of our movable tunnel system. For more information on the UK...
Okay, I thought that was a pretty interesting video since we were talking about how to account for maybe salinity in a structure. And those movable tunnels are, while they're not a solution for everybody, and we don't see them too often because they're a little more costly, and they have their own set of problems, but they can really fit well into certain cropping systems for people. Let's think about soil sterilization or solarization to sterilize soil in a high tunnel. This is something that you might do potentially to kill maybe nematodes or potentially fungal pathogens if you've had those in the soils, or maybe even annual weed seeds to keep them from coming up. And it's a kind of a simple concept. People don't use it that often, but it can be a practice that you can utilize, where basically you're just draping plastic sheeting over the soil. You want to prepare that soil like you would a normal seed bed. So, you know, you're going to be doing some tillage work and getting it ready. And then you also would irrigate this. Having a wet soil is going to conduct heat a little better than a dry soil. But you can put something down like just regular plastic. In this picture, this is some work they did in Indiana that looks at just 6 mil plastic. And this is just plastic that was removed from as a greenhouse covering. You know, it was old, like we talked about before. It was removed, and then they utilized it there. So it got double duty, so there's no cost involved. And they also tried it with some very thin plastic, like kind of like painter's plastic that you might see even. And you just cover that with some type of transparent polyethylene either way, and close the structure up. You know, all the side curtains, all the end walls are closed up. And what you're trying to achieve is temperatures that are greater than about 110 degrees Fahrenheit for several weeks. And this can really do a great job of killing some of those potential problems that you have in the soil. There is a website I put down here at the bottom, another one from Kentucky that does talk about solarization. It's probably worth looking at if you were interested. I would say just be careful with equipment in a structure, PVC pipe, and maybe temperature sensors or other things, equipment that you have in the structure can be damaged by those high heat conditions. Because remember, we're trying to get the soil temperature up to 110, but the air temperature is going to be very warm in there. And probably much more important than that is watch out for people that potentially could walk into the structure, or even children that could walk into the structure. Some of you maybe have been in a greenhouse that's been closed up in the summertime. I know I have, and I've been in some that are really tight houses that are closed up for whatever reason in the summertime, and it's very, very hot in there, and it could really be bad for somebody to get in there, caught in there. Animals too, you wouldn't want them in there. When we think about high tunnel structures, we think about potential crops, and there are many. And I mentioned tomatoes there at the very beginning because that's one of the things that people try to grow, want to grow first. Tomatoes are easy to grow, one, and they're fairly easy to sell. And so tomatoes can be a great crop for a high tunnel. They seem like they're kind of made for a structure like this. But also cool season crops, leafy greens, some of the cold crops, lettuces, things like that, can do well in the wintertime, maybe with additional covers like in that center picture, some hooped row covers for additional protection. There's an interesting one here about summer squash. I wanted to get you to potentially look at if you're interested in high tunnel production of summer squash. There's a link there to a study that looked at about I think it was 4 or 5 different varieties of summer squash and how they performed in the high tunnel. So that's worth checking out. That can be a good early season producer, maybe at your roadside stand or at a farmer's market. Also, if you look here in the center, Purdue has put out a high tunnel cucumber production guide. So if you're interested in cucumbers, that might be worth looking at, and you can find that at Purdue. And there's even, if you can see it, there's a number, ID 521W is the publication number. And we've been growing long English cucumbers in greenhouses hydroponically for years, but there's so many different varieties out there other than those long English ones, the Bait Alpha types, the small ones with the thin skin, and just a lot of others. So cucumbers might be a good one for you. Even ornamental things like cut flowers, like in that top picture, can do very well in a high tunnel structure. Things like those that pictures of snapdragons, and you can get different maturing dates for different classes and series of snapdragons that will mature based on where you are, based on the cold and warm temperatures. And so you can get some early ones, and you can even try things. We've done things like anemone and ranunculus that are more cool season, but the ability to put them in the tunnel very early and still, maintain a fairly cool season for a while is done. They've done well. I'll mention berries. We've done a fair amount of work with raspberries, especially, but also blackberries in a high tunnel. And now with some blueberries, containerized blueberries in a high tunnel seems to be a really good way to go. So there's some potential there, and I can give you some more information. And in fact, in February, we're going to be having our annual berry conference at VSU. Well, it'll be virtual, but hopefully we'll have some dates for that. It's going to be in February. And so if you want to know more about berries, that might be a good one. As we're moving on for time, I think I wanted to show a couple videos, short videos now, if it's all right. Just kind of showing some, when we think about different times of growing things in high tunnels. This is a video here with in Loudoun County with Jim Hankins, and looking at his operation. Just a short, very basic video looking at what he does for the late spring into summer in his tunnels.
Hi and welcome. Today we're at Fauquier Education Farm. We're here with Mr. Jim Hankins, the executive director here at the farm. And Jim, it's warm out. We're talking today though about what you can grow in a greenhouse like this. Now is this a greenhouse?
We would normally call this a high tunnel. Okay. It's a temporary structure, it's plastic. You know, it wouldn't really give you the protection all the way through the winter. Okay. But it does extend the seasons. Okay. What a lot of people don't realize is that midsummer, it's a fantastic environment, and really tropical plants respond to the additional heat and the environment inside this high tunnel.
Okay, well, I'd love to go in here and see what you're growing. Well, Jim, this is great. A lot of really good growth in here, and you're right. A lot of commercial farmers use this to bump the growing season, but like you said, you're not doing that here.
No, what we're doing here is, you know, taking advantage of the tropical heat to encourage these plants, and you know, you get better quality. Okay. If you plant the right types of varieties. These little eggplant go nuts in here. Wow. If you've got the right varieties, and this year we have planted, you know, greenhouse varieties of cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers. Okay. The eggplant are just a standard variety that I would plant out in the field. Okay. But in this environment, they grow so much quicker. Right. You know, you have to monitor the heat. You know, in here, I can raise and lower the sides to allow air circulation, to allow insect pollination. Okay. You know, if you've got a smaller greenhouse, you need to have a thermostat on it. I see. I have a 12-foot by 12-foot greenhouse, and at 90 degrees, a fan kicks on and, you know, cools it off a little bit. We don't have that in here. It's just opening and closing the sides. I see. But, you know, it won't slow down production.
So Jim, this is covered because you're not getting any rainfall. So what do you do to get water to these plants?
We use drip irrigation underneath the landscape fabric. You know, you can set that up on a timer. Okay. You do need more water in here. More heat means the plants are breathing more and they're losing more water. And you pretty much have to water almost every day on those really hot days. Sure. But it's really easy. A drip irrigation system is easy to set up. Yep. And uses very, very little water.
So the heat can be a little bit of a challenge, but you ventilate. Yes. Now, how about insects? Are they a problem in here, or they just stay away from here?
Well, you need to leave the sides open. You know, you need to allow for insect pollination. Unfortunately, there are some pests that respond to this tropical environment just as well as the plants do. You know, and some pests, aphids and mites that you won't run into really badly in the field, once they become established in here, their population can skyrocket. So you need to closely monitor and spray as you need.
Okay, and you could probably, because you're in a somewhat enclosed environment, can you release beneficial insects in here, possibly?
You could possibly. There are plenty of people that are releasing beneficial insects, ladybugs in particular, for the aphids, you know, in the high tunnels.
Okay, so you've got eggplants in here, cucumbers.
Two different kinds of tomatoes and bell peppers as well.
Okay, wonderful. Now, if a gardener, this is kind of a large structure, they probably wouldn't need this. Yeah. What would you recommend for the home gardener to kind of do what you're doing here, main season production?
I know of people who, you know, if you look up caterpillar tunnels. Okay. It's a small structure that you can build yourself just by bending PVC tubing and putting plastic over it. Okay. There are structures that people could build themselves, you know, really easily in an afternoon that will give you the same results.
Oh, that's great. That is wonderful. Well, I can really see great growth here, and it's doing really well for you. Thank you for letting us come out today and see what you're doing. This is wonderful.
Always glad to have you.
Well, for more information about structures like this, contact your local county extension office and talk to a master gardener. For From the Ground Up, I'm...
So that was kind of real basic look at some of the things that Jim was doing up there in the summertime. And I just wanted to quickly show you this one. This is in Louisa County, and this is more of a winter planting. But you'll notice there's different ways that people grow. There's lots of different ways to get about these things.
Well, hi and welcome. Today we're in Louisa County, Virginia. We're at Hill Farm and we're talking to Susan and Scott Hill. They've got a small farm here raising all kinds of things for the local market. Scott, tell me about your operation. How long have you been doing this?
Well, we generally been doing it for 5 years now, and we market to the Charlottesville area. And we've got 4 high tunnels that we use in a small hobby type greenhouse. And we also have an open garden here up this end and down the bottom here, where we do cold weather stuff that will survive to a point. With the cold weather we've had here in the past couple weeks, killed my Brussels sprouts plants, but we knew they were going to die off. And we also have several beds in the back that are asparagus, and we have a great assortment of vegetables.
A lot of different things that go into the markets for people to buy. Well, it sounds like the key here during this time of the year when it's very cold, and it is cold out here today, are your high tunnel production areas. And you built all these high tunnels here, right?
Built them all myself, yes I have.
So I'd really love to go see some of the different crops you're growing here. What do you think, Susan?
Great.
Go check them out?
Love to show them off.
All right. Well, Susan, we're in this high tunnel. It's a lot warmer in here, I have to say. Pretty cold outside, a little bit warmer in here. So that makes a much better environment for growing these crops.
Absolutely.
Now, what kind of crops are you growing? I know some of these are winter hardy. What have you got here?
Well, we've been working on finding crops that can handle the cold.
Okay.
That's the secret to growing in the winter, obviously, is find things that can overwinter and can grow in the cold.
Right.
So we look at days of light or hours of light they need, as well as cold tolerance. Okay. So what we have here is a variety, and some of this is still an experiment. These are baby cabbages. We've found that the smaller cabbages do better in the winter because they grow in 53 days as opposed to the big ones, which are 90. Okay? So we're doing well with the little cabbages.
Some of those look almost ready to harvest.
They are. These will be good. These are probably these guys here about 2 weeks out.
Okay.
These are 2 different varieties of kale that we're trying. This one is from Italy. This is our standard kale that we grow in the United States, the wild kale. You can see the difference in the cold tolerance. This is not doing as well as the one that we typically grow in this area. Okay. Once again, we have Swiss chard. We found that broccoli rabe will not work in the wintertime.
Right. Now these are in raised beds. Yes. You're not growing directly in the ground here. So tell me why you're doing this.
Actually, it's considered directly in the ground because this is an NRCS grant.
Okay.
Okay, so there is nothing between the raised bed and the ground.
Okay.
Okay? So, and Scott designed these so that we could control the environment in the beds, the dirt, how much lime we need, whatever. But also, we had to think about the ergonomics of it. I can sit here on this side and work the entire bed from the other side without having to crawl around on my hands and knees.
Oh, that's great. That makes a lot of sense.
Wonderful. And then with the raised bed, you also can put your hoop.
Okay.
These will come out in the summertime.
Okay.
And we can go ahead and just pull it over because the cloth should not be touching the plant.
So right, you had earlier today, you had the frost protection fabric over the beds, and you pulled them off because last night it got very cold.
Right, and what we generally do is we do 1 cover at 30 degrees. Okay. We do 2 covers if we're going down in the teens.
Okay. So if you're our home gardener, do you see some benefit in maybe having something like that and hooped row covers over your beds?
You could even do it outside. Right. So we get 10 degrees from having this big tunnel. That gives us 10 degrees protection from outside. Right. We get about another 10 by putting the cover on. Okay. So outside, if you put the low covers on, then you would get about 10 degrees cross protection. But also, the moisture not getting on the plant is what protects it.
Gotcha. So in the springtime, somebody's wanting to get a little bit of earliness. They maybe could put these metal hoops, put the row cover over there, and maybe start something a little bit earlier outside.
Absolutely, and it's a very inexpensive way to do it. You could be starting your crops in February, March, as opposed to waiting until May, and then you're actually getting your production before your worms and things are coming in.
Gotcha. Now, I noticed on the floor here, you've got bark, right?
Yes, actually, it is cedar.
Cedar, okay.
Cedar mulch. This is very slick in here in the winter with the red clay in Virginia.
Right.
And so we tried rocks. That didn't work because slugs love rocks, and we had lots of them. So we came across this cedar, and it's great on your legs, and it also keeps the slugs out of the tunnel. And it lasts about 3 years.
Keeps the weeds down too, right?
Keeps the weeds down too.
That's great. That is great.
They don't fall, yes.
Well, this is a really nice operation, and I imagine that as people are in Virginia, if they're finding locally grown fruits and vegetables and things this time of year, it's probably coming from an operation just like this.
Absolutely. High tunnels are coming up all over Virginia because there is a huge demand for local produce in the winter.
That's true. Well, listen, we really appreciate you all letting us come out here today. This is a really fantastic operation. I know it takes a lot of hard work, but it looks really good.
We like to show off growing local.
Great. Well, for more information about winter.
All right. Well, I just kind of wanted to, like I said, show those couple videos when we think about high tunnels, and you kind of get to see more than just my pictures and me talking about some different operations and how they might look. So as we kind of quickly move through here, I don't want to keep you too long, but some final things to think about when we think about tunnels is they are more intensive in terms of management and labor. The right site is very important to be able, like we talked about, to be able to find something that's well drained and suitable for your structure to be in. If you get a lot of snow, like you all might, a peaked roof structure is going to be a little better for shedding that snow than a round or true Quonset hut type. Because it's important, especially if you've got tall crops like raspberries, blackberries, tomatoes, cucumbers, having a taller sidewall or opening for that ventilation is good, that you can build in as you're planning the structure and building it. It's something to put in then. High value crops are very important. This is expensive real estate. We didn't talk about costs, but and they're all over the board for structures, but and they usually fluctuate a little bit with metal cost. But either way, when you're paying $4 or $5 a square foot for the structure, and you've got a 28, let's see, maybe a 20 by 50, that's 1,000 square feet. So when you're talking about $4,000 or $5,000 into the structure itself, you want to have crops in there that have good market value that you can sell. Let's see, sanitation is important. And as I quickly move through, I wanted to, here are some resources for high tunnels. There are several companies that are listed, and we've used all of them. That's the reason I put them there, but there's many more out there, as well as places like the Noble Foundation in Oklahoma that do a fair amount of research and work with high tunnels, and the others, Sayre and Atra, are good ones. This is a one I mentioned. It's a pretty good book, a really good book actually, by Pam Dowling. She's a grower in Louisa County, Virginia, and has taken all of her experience over the years and put it into this book manual situation here. It's really worth thinking about if you're going to get into this at all. I will quickly go through here and mention some of the other things that we work with and might have potential for you when we think about true greenhouse production of vegetables. And most of the time that's done in containers in some type of soilless media, a hydroponic system where there's no real dirt or soil in the structure at all. Things as compared to the high tunnel, where things are mostly grown in the ground or maybe in raised beds, of course. And now you're seeing more and more potential with even grow lights and facilities like that bottom picture. As lighting becomes a little less expensive to install, the newer lighting is very energy efficient. So anyway, things like tomatoes and peppers and lettuce and culinary herbs and just strawberries, just a host of anything can be grown pretty much in these hydroponic systems, the different ones that they are, the NFT systems, media bag systems, float bed systems. While we don't have time to go into all that today, there's some potential possibly in growing vegetables in greenhouses. And right here, we see some of the advantages. But certainly when you think about the technical knowledge, it's going to be greater than even a high tunnel production, and then greater than also than regular conventional vegetable production. A lot more things to manage and take care of. And again, like I mentioned, lots of things can be grown this way. It just varies and depends on what you can sell and make money on, what's economically viable. And the last thing I'll mention is the idea of aquaponics, which is going to be using that hydroponic plant production system. And instead of using synthetic fertilizers to feed those plants, a grower would use fish effluent from a recirculating aquaculture system to basically pump through those plants, or to move through the root zone of those plants to feed those plants. As that fish wastewater is rich in nitrogen and other elements, it takes, the plants take up those nutrients, but also they act a little bit like a biofilter and are taking up some of the more toxic, even ammonia and nitrates and nitrate that the fish, it's toxic to the fish. So it's a symbiotic relationship where the plants get something out of it, and the fish system gets something out of it. So it's pretty interesting. A lot of people are thinking about this type of thing, especially we see it on the hobby or small scale, raising things like tilapia, like the picture you see on the bottom right, or on the bottom left. So pretty interesting area here that we can definitely talk more about at a later date, both the hydroponics and the aquaponics. Kind of running out of time, so I'm gonna kind of wrap it up now. For aquaponics and hydroponics, there are different resources here for things like structures and systems and seeds. You know, Johnny Seeds, Paramount Seeds, and there's others out there for sure that you could use as a resource. Well, that was kind of quick and dirty about growing under plastic. Kind of give you a general overview is the best we could do in a fairly short amount of time we've got today. But I appreciate your interest and sticking with us the whole time. And Ashley, if you've got time, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them if I can.